Oh, all right, Ben, let's get started on the next episode. I think you're going to show today what I think is one of the kind of unsung heroes of both SQL Server 2025 and SQL Server 2022, the Polybase integration. What's going to happen today, Ben?
I would have agreed to that statement until very recently, to be quite honest, because first of all, yes, I agree, amazing feature. However, recently I was presenting at a user group, and after that user group, there were like at least 5 people, because I was also talking about what we're going to talk about today in a bit. And they were like, oh, yeah, we've been using that in SQL 22 a lot. So it's like, okay, a lot of people are actually using that feature, because I would have thought as well, oh, this is one of the hidden gems that people may not even be aware of. But still, there may be a couple. So let's take a look at that. What we're going to talk about today is object storage integration in SQL Server. And in SQL Server 2025, unlike SQL Server 2022, you can do all that right out of the engine without any extra tools installed. So in SQL Server 2022, remember we did a pre-con on this. Remember when you broke my demos in that pre-con? Because
I've asked for forgiveness, Ben. I've asked for forgiveness.
Yes, you have. I haven't granted said forgiveness, but that may be for maybe that's how we're going to end this show at some point later this year.
Well, because I can't touch your demos right now, so there's some safety in this, right?
The system is protecting itself. This is basically what's happening here. So no, in SQL Server 2022, you would have need to install a couple of extra components like Polybase and all that to be able to actually access data stored in external block storage systems like S3 or ADLS, for example. And in 2025, all that comes right out of the engine. And I think, while you might argue that, well, it's just one extra checkbox or one extra argument when you're installing through DBA tools or through the command line or whatever, I would agree. Still, most people prefer to keep their installs as clean as possible. So just taking one extra moving part out of the equation is going to make it a lot easier again for a lot of people to just make use of that feature, if that makes sense.
100%. I think just reducing the friction of adoption. And I think really the concept being able to go and get data or export data in and out of SQL Server from other platforms, other file formats with the no external tools now is such a powerful feature.
And accessing it as if it were in SQL, because I think that's the other. Because, I mean, you were always able to kind of get data out of SQL or data into SQL, but you would need all that additional overhead, and all that is pretty much gone now. But shall we take a look?
I think we should.
I think we should have like an intermediate jingle before we head into the demos for some of the upcoming episodes. But let's not talk about that for now. So I'm on CTP 2.1, obviously, as one does. And as always, I'm just going to create a new database. I'm going to call it file data. If it already exists, I'm dropping it, creating my master key. Of course, we're going to store credentials. We've seen that in previous episodes. So here's the first important part. Is Polybase installed? No, it's not. Polybase is not enabled. There is no Polybase on this box. This is basically what I'm saying. Before we even start using any of the blob storage, block storage. So many complicated words. One of the things that when talking to people is many people have no idea how easy it actually is to even just access a locally stored text file, which is always baffling me, because yes, SQL is so hard, because if you always have a little text file somewhere and then you need to write this much ETL. I'm like, no, you actually don't. So I'm just accessing a text file that is sitting here on my C drive, where all your operational data should be stored, right? And as one does, I could create a table. I can do a bulk insert on that and then do my select. And boom, there we go. I just imported some sample data from a text file.
That's pretty cool.
I agree. Thank you, Anthony. However, would you also agree that those 10 lines of data are not necessarily big data or huge data or a lot of data?
Would you need a cluster for that big data, Ben?
I probably would not. I may need for the next one. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating another table. I'm going to call it sales data, and then I'm just going to use a little random sales function here that will basically populate that table for me with entirely random data. So every single time I run that demo, I will get slightly different amount of rows and also slightly different data. This is going to run for the next 17 minutes. Oh no, it's done. So 7.6.
The magic of editing.
7.6 million rows, which may still not be huge data, but it is more than 10. Let's agree to that. So this is basically what my data looks like. I got all my sales in there with a sales state and a customer ID, product ID. I obviously don't have customers or products, so those IDs may not be super meaningful, but it does the trick for what we're trying to achieve here today.
No
TLDR,
customers, no
I have a
products.
fact table that has 7.6 million rows. And now I want to offload that data on my S3 storage, which is one of the potential targets you could use to offload your data to. And I'm picking S3 because S3 is what you would usually find on-prem, because all kinds of storage vendors like Pure, but also others, or even what I'm using, MinIO, which I can just run as a local container or local VM or whatever your preference is.
And you could do that in one line of code as well.
I could do that in one line of. I use 17 lines of code just because that's how I run.
Well, let's add a link to the show notes. I actually have that Docker Compose implementation on GitHub.
We will do that. You can also do ADLS, for example. But we're talking about SQL 25, the on-prem box product. And while I'm very well aware that some people, actually a lot of people, are also running that in VMs in the cloud and all that, I think the actual value for these customers and for the people using that is also using storage that can be on-prem, and ADLS cannot be. So unless you're doing something like Azure Local, which probably, I'm not even sure, it probably has an ADLS kind of flavor in there. But most people don't have that, so S3 it is. And the only thing I need to do is I need to allow Polybase exports. That's the only feature flag I need to enable. To be able to work with storage or data stored in files, you need something called a file format. And I'm going to define two here, one as a CSV and one as Parquet. And the first thing you'll see is for the Parquet one, all I'm just doing is, hey, Parquet. I could also do one that uses Delta, for example, which would only require format type equals Delta. For CSV, you need a little more information because for CSV, Parquet is a binary format, CSV is not. So for a CSV, you need to define, hey, what's your terminator? Is it a comma? Is it a semicolon? Is there a string delimiter? Are we going to have a first row 1 or first row 2? Are we going to use type defaults and all that? And that is what I'm basically defining here. So all I'm doing here is I'm creating some metadata. And then the final puzzle piece I need to be able to talk to my S3 storage is a credential, which is also what I needed my master key for earlier. So as one does, I kept my credentials for my MinIO at the default. So my username is MinIO admin, and so is my password. So I'm creating this credential here and my external data source. So basically all I'm doing is creating that pointer. So this is the URL that I'm accessing. Similar to the REST API, similar to creating embeddings, this is requiring SSL. So despite this saying S3 in the background, this thing needs to be encrypted. So my endpoint needs to have a valid and trusted certificate. Otherwise, SQL will not be talking to it.
And do a whole show series just on that, Ben, creating and managing certificates in the enterprise.
Or we just give them the script where basically you create the script yourself, self-signed, and then make it auto-trusted on all your machines in the domain, as one does. Or not.
Yeah. Don't tell your security team.
I remember the discussion we had when I was preparing the pre-con, and I was just giving 777 permissions to basically all the files in the demo to make things easier, and you were not happy about that. But again, that's for a different
show.
So I got my external data source, I got my credential, and I got my format. First of all, I stored my same sample file on that S3 storage. So open row set from, that is my sales data bucket, sample data.txt. My data source is my S3. using the CSV format with my first row equals 2 because we're skipping the first row. And here I'm actually, since this is a CSV, I'm actually providing my data types here because I want them to be proper data types. I don't want anything to be guessed here. I want to be very specific. So by just doing this, I can query those exact 10 rows again. And it finished in 0.3 seconds. So I think that is super fast. And this concludes my demo, right? Because I think reading 10 rows in 0.3 seconds, it doesn't get faster than this anyway. Then again, I already went ahead and created that 7.6 million rows of data. So why don't we just use this? And what I can do here is I can use the statement create external table as, or CTAS, where I'm basically providing a name format table, a location. So in my sales data bucket, I'm using a subfolder called Parquet just because I want to separate those out. S3 is again my data source. So the combination of my endpoint and my credentials. I'm using my file format, and select star from sales data is my query that I will be writing to that table. So by running this, I'm going ahead and writing 7.6 million rows in 1.2 seconds to an external storage. And I'm not even using any fancy external storage. I'm actually using a container that is using local storage. So imagine how fast that would be if I would be using something meaningful as my backend here. This is super, because I always also hear people, yeah, it's nice that you can do this, but the performance is going to be like, man, you can do it. We're like, I respectfully disagree. Would I put all my tables from my OLTP system into an external table? Yeah, most probably not. Because you shouldn't. But especially if you're about to offload like archive data and all that. And I think we're going to have an episode coming up as well about maybe not archive data, but generally data that does not necessarily have to sit in your primary file group in your database. But we're going to talk about that. How about next week or so?
Sounds lovely, Ben. But I think there's also an important story about access, right? So now other systems can come along and get access to this Parquet file over S3, potentially in different parts of the application, or those systems can generate data and it can land in these buckets, and we can pull that into SQL Server as well.
Agreed. And also, assuming you have multiple systems needing to access that very same data, I could create an external table pointing to that same bucket on another SQL machine. No ETL, no nothing involved, because they would always be reading from the same live data. So you're also just getting rid of a lot of middlemen.
Can we just coin the term no TL right now and like come up with a whole new like marketing campaign around that? What do you think?
I think we should definitely do that.
Okay, no TL.
No Centino does no TL. That's very catchy. No, I have no idea how I fit in there, but we'll figure it out.
The B is silent.
Exactly. I could do the same thing as a CSV, which is taking slightly longer, but not a whole lot. So we got Parquet and CSV. CSV is a plain text format. Parquet is a compressed binary format. They're just as fast, and CSVs are easier to read. So everybody should use CSVs. Do you have thoughts on this, Anthony?
Well, I don't know. I think, well, number one, I think you already defined the complexity earlier in that you have to kind of know something about the data to access it. Like with Parquet being a standard format and the schema is somewhat baked into the file format, then the accessibility into there becomes a little easier, right?
Agreed.
Yeah.
And to be quite honest, if we would be having the discussion between Parquet and Delta, I think it would be much harder because they're still very comparable in what they do. In general, unless you're really just offloading those 10 rows, my kind of default answer would always be to go with Parquet. It takes less space. It is less maintenance. It is easier to read. It is easier to manage. So
yeah, why not butter?
Why not butter?
I don't know. Yeah, Parquet, butter. No,
I have no idea what is happening. And
salted, unsalted, right?
Fair. I can query that table as if it were a local table in my SQL Server. I could join it against my local data, etc., etc. And again, select customer ID, count star from sales data at 3 Parquet group by customer ID. This is actually scanning through those 7.6 million rows. in my storage in no time. And I could do the same thing against my CSV. And we had 0.6 seconds up here and 3.5 seconds down there. And I think there is our answer as well, because while the write may be equally fast with the CSV already lagging slightly behind, but you could argue 1.2 to 1.6 seconds, that might also just be a discrepancy that, depending on what else was going on at the time, you might already be losing those 0.4 seconds. When it comes to reading and scanning through that data, the Parquet will definitely have huge advantages over the CSV there. So repeating myself here, Parquet.
Yeah, and then the compressibility of it, comparing, the binary format to the ASCII format, you're going to get a very dramatic compression ratio on Parquet,
Agreed.
and that's going to have something to do with the read performance, because you're going to read the compressed data off of your remote storage and then decompress it inside the instance, which means you're just moving less stuff across the wire.
Agreed. Also, storage is expensive, so compression is always good. Unless you're a storage vendor.
Storage is free.
No, that's only true in the cloud, I think. But
Right.
I may be confusing things. Like I said, I could now do the exact same thing with an ADLS SAS token against my ADLS storage and all that, and also other targets. But to me, the biggest one is honestly the S3, because it is the most commonly adopted and most widely used across all the storage vendors from what I've been seeing.
Yes.
But again, the code would be exactly the same. If I had an SAS token that I would want to share with you here in my video, I could put that in here, create that, and run the exact same code rather than running it against my on-prem MinIO S3 against my ADLS archive, and the same code would work just as well. All right, Anthony, shall we wrap this up?
Let's wrap it up, Ben.
So I think the biggest takeaway here is, functionality-wise, nothing has changed between 2022 and 2025. Just the requirements have been lowered a lot. So all that we've seen today, I could have shown you the same code in 2022, just with a bunch more extra steps before getting there. So in 2025, basically all you do is you enable that Polybase export, which is by default disabled, so users don't just take your data and push it somewhere. We did not really talk about how to secure those credentials and all that, which would be a whole other episode by itself. But the fact how easy it has become to offload data to files, share that data with other systems, because it's now in a proprietary, open, accessible storage bucket.
It's like a juxtaposition there. Proprietary, open. I mean, what are we doing here, Ben?
I have no idea where I'm going with this. But I still feel you're getting my point.
Totally. Are there scenarios in SQL Server 2025 where I have to install Polybase still, or is it completely hands off now?
So my understanding is, but I've never really went down that road. Polybase basically was the file-based thing, especially the block storage. And I think for that it is entirely gone. But Polybase also enabled you to use external drivers and all that. And I think for those, you will still need to install it.
Correct.
However, I never did that, because doing something with a file, that is, and this is where your mileage may vary, because now I'm kind of becoming that person that is like, yeah, no, I don't want that in my engine. When it really comes to using an external connector to read data, to access external systems and all that, I'm personally more comfortable doing that in a real ETL tool.
Okay.
At least for the use cases that I would be using it for. But still, if you're using any of those C data connectors and all that, that back then came out with BDC in 2019, good times.
Pour one out.
That is where I'm pretty sure you would still need Polybase.
Got it. Cool.
Are we playing the music?
Let's play it.